Welcome to episode 7 of Behind the Shield. My name is James Gearing, and I'm extremely excited to bring you this week's guest, Sebastian Junger. Sebastian is probably best known for his book, The Perfect Storm, which was written about the fishing boat, the Andrea Gale, and was consequently made into a movie featuring George Clooney. However, some of his other work, I think, is really what drew me to him as a first responder, as a firefighter. He's written 2 books, War and Tribe, that really resonated with me about the effects of trauma on a human, basically, and then what happens after they leave their group, their tribe. And then he's also the man that brought us Restrepo, the documentary about the 173rd Airborne guys that were on a remote outpost in the middle of the Korengal Valley in Afghanistan. And those men saw more combat than any other unit in the conflict so far. And again, he sees what it's like to be a soldier in this crazy, crazy war, and then the effects of their time served after they leave the valley. The insight that he has on humans, on us as a species, on the fact that we fundamentally are supposed to be tribal. He talks about how when early settlers came to the US, many of them were fleeing to Native American tribes to be a part of something that they felt was more organic and almost worthy than our quote unquote civilized society that we have. And his view on people banding together during tragedy like 9/11 and the London Blitz, and then the effects of these men and women when they leave the conflict, they leave the tribe, they leave their army units, navy units, and come back into suburban America or England or whatever country they demob from. And the troubles that these men and women have, and how this leaving the tribe affects them. And now is when the PTSD and all these other afflictions start to hit them. So I really wanted to get him on the show. I really wanted to pick his brains about some of his philosophies. And in all honesty, I also want to urge everyone listening to this podcast to go out and buy Tribe. I am not the kind of person that can pick up a book that is full of fluff and just fight my way through hundreds and hundreds of pages. He is described as a very, very lean writer, and I can absolutely testify to that. I can't remember the exact page number. I haven't got it next to me, but I believe it's sub 200 pages, and it is absolutely jam-packed with just totally engaging stories that really get you hooked and make you kind of rethink about everything, about the way we're living at the moment, about, gyms where we walk in and we hook into our iPhones and don't talk to another person. Suburban communities where even though we're surrounded by each other, we barely know our neighbors. And how that is so different from the way that we were, I wouldn't say raised, but the way our species has evolved for generations and generations. So I was so happy when he agreed to be on the show. I reached out to him, and when he found out it was to help the first responders of the world, he jumped at the chance and responded immediately and said that he would come on the show. So I think this will be eye-opening for a lot of people. I think it really will reprogram the way a lot of you guys think after you hear some of his philosophy. And he doesn't even claim to own it. It's his observations of, modern combat, of the Native American culture, of the New Yorkers during 9/11, and all these different things that he's observed. And when people have stepped up and become the best versions of themselves and the strongest communities. So I am not going to ramble anymore. I really want to get you listening to him as soon as possible. And when we're done with this, if you leave with one thing, I urge you to go on Amazon or your local bookshop and buy a copy of his book, Tribe. It really should be in every firehouse, every police station, every EMT or paramedic station, because it really pertains to anyone that puts their life on the line, that chooses to serve others, and then sees these horrendous things and is exposed to these terrible things, and then is one day taken away from that, whether it's injury, retirement, promotion, whatever it is. And I think that all of you are going to be able to relate in your own special way. So I'm going to stop yabbering and get right onto this interview. And I hope you all enjoy it. And I'd love to hear your feedback. So without further ado, I give you Sebastian Junger. Sebastian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to jump straight in because I know your time is extremely valuable. You are known for writing about the working man. The viewers of this show are in the same category, working men and women. I'm assuming that you wanted to be an author since you were pretty young, but how did you transition to finding an interest in the working person?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I grew up in a middle-class suburb, and I had a good education, and I didn't know that, honestly, that many people in those kinds of sort of labor-type jobs. But my adopted uncle, Ellis, who was in my book Tribe, he had done a lot of work in the 50s with labor rights, and he sort of opened my mind to that issue. And then later, I had a job as a climber for tree companies. I was an arborist, and I worked 70, 80 feet in the air with a chainsaw and a rope, and I taking trees down. And I got hurt pretty badly doing it. And that actually, I for a long time wanted to become a professional writer, and I was writing occasionally for newspapers and magazines. But that sort of galvanized my interest in work-related issues, and I started writing about dangerous jobs. And the first one that I really focused on was commercial fishing, because I was living in the fishing town of Gloucester in Massachusetts when a huge storm hit and sank a local boat named the Andrea Gale. And then that story that I investigated became, eventually became my first book, The Perfect Storm.
Yeah, which was an incredible book. They made into a movie. It became a smash hit, I know that. So one of your other books that you wrote was a book called Fire, which is a collection of your short stories. And the first couple, you featured smoke jumpers out west. So how did you get involved with that, and what were your experiences there?
Well, I had a whole list of dangerous jobs I wanted to look at, and I never was able to write the book that I envisioned, which was a whole collection series on dangerous jobs. One of those jobs was forest firefighting, wildland fire. So I did the research for that and wrote a magazine piece for it, but it never became part of a book. And so that was, there was also a book that came out around then called Young Men and Fire by Norman MacLean. There was really, I think, one of the best nonfiction books in the sort of canon of American literature. And so I was a huge admirer of that book as well. And I think that sort of like inspired me. I can't quite remember the timing of all that, but it was around then.
Right. And you actually were embedded with those smoke jumpers for a small while, is that correct?
Well, no. I mean, they jump out of airplanes on their fires. So I was able to interview them. I spent some time on the hotshot crews that get to the fire, on foot usually. But I didn't jump out of any airplanes. I mean, that's not actually really allowed.
Okay, yeah. But I know that you were out there in the wildland with them for a little bit. Okay, so transitioning then, so what steered you towards becoming a military journalist? War reporting was one of the things that interested me as a dangerous job. And in the early 90s, there was a war in Bosnia. Obviously, long before the U.S. got there, it was a civil war, and Sarajevo was under siege by Bosnian Serb forces. And like a lot of other freelancers, I got into Sarajevo on a UN relief flight, and started my, in a very sort of like clumsy and uninformed way, I started my fledgling career as a war reporter, freelance war reporter. Right. And as a civilian up to that point, what was that initial experience like, going from living in urban or suburban America to being in the middle of a war zone?
Life was more normal than I expected. I mean, people still do everything they do when there's no war. Just everything's a little bit harder. Water doesn't come out of the pipes in your kitchen. You have to go get it at a pump. There's no electricity. You're burning candles. You can't go to the supermarket to get food. You have to grow food in your backyard, what have you. I mean, it reduced life to a kind of communal, like sort of primitive communalism that actually I found really appealing in some ways. I mean, the closeness of the society, the closeness of these neighborhoods, of these families was really, incredibly appealing. And much later, I went back to Sarajevo, a year and a half ago, 20 years after the war ended, and this one person I talked to, I talk about this in my book, but one woman I talked to said that everyone really missed the war precisely because people were so close and so collaborative during those difficult days.
Right. Yeah, and that's pretty much one of the main topics in your latest book, Tribe. That publication, that book, I think is going to resonate so deeply as it did with me in first responders as well as military that haven't read it yet. The different ways of looking not only at war itself, but at how people are when they come back from war, and then looking at our own country as well. So you in the book talked about that very thing, about how communities that maybe weren't as strong initially were brought together during times of trouble, for example, the London Blitz and 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, human society reacts to trauma and hardship and threat by unifying. Those circumstances don't bring out bad behavior in people. They bring out typically pro-social behavior in people, group-oriented behavior. We're social. Humans are social primates. We survive and even thrive in the natural world because we function in groups. And when we're under threat, we cohere into those groups even more strongly than we do ordinarily. Modern society, because it is so safe, so protected, so stable, we don't really need to function in terms of groups in order to get by until there's a crisis, until there's a threat, until there's an attack or an earthquake or what have you. And then people do that very, very naturally. It clearly feels good to do that because people often say that they missed, the worst events of their lives, 9/11, the Blitz in London. Why would anyone miss those terrible days? But in fact, that's exactly what people do because they like the feeling of being needed by their group. They like the feeling of acting well, acting altruistically. We enjoy those experiences. They make us feel good about ourselves, even though there are very unfortunate, sad circumstances that require them.
Absolutely. Another thing that you discussed during the book, which I found was fascinating, was the number of reported depression cases and PTSD cases during these times of tragedy. These are people that had these symptoms before, actually declined during these tragic events.
Yeah, I mean, the British government was prepared for mass psychiatric casualties during the Blitz, and to their surprise, admissions to psych wards went down during the Blitz. A psychologist that I found, an Irish psychologist that I found, did some really interesting research about depression levels during the what are called the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the violence and the murders and the fighting that happened in 1969, 1970. And what he found was that the more violent the district, the lower the depression levels in the society. And the only district that found where he found depression levels to go up was County Derry, where there was no violence whatsoever.
Oh, really? Yeah, it's interesting talking about Ireland. I grew up in a town in England that was next to an army base, and during that whole time in my childhood, I had to check under my car for bombs and that kind of thing because it would be a perfect place to put one to kind of hit the base from the outside. And then when I came to the US, there was a lot of kind of pro-IRA feeling until we had some terrorist attacks on our doorstep, and people really kind of were introduced to what terrorism was really like and realized that there was not some Hollywood version of a freedom fighter, but the same kind of murderous, horrible character that exists in all these terrorist organizations around the world.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. It's really interesting, the role of stress on a community and how it affects people. I was in El Paso, Texas, and I talked to a student at the University of El Paso who grew up across the river and in a very, very violent neighborhood during these outrageous drug wars that were raging in northern Mexico, some years ago. And I mean, there was so much gunfire on the Mexican side that the bullets would land on the campus of the University of El Paso on the American side. At any rate, this kid that I was talking to said that he grew up during that time in northern Mexico, and that he's living the dream, right? He got a scholarship or whatever it was. He gained entry to the United States. He's a student at an American university, having come from the very violent neighborhoods across the river. And he said that he really missed those days, that he was incredibly lonely. And he knew he was sort of living the dream, but actually he was much, much happier during those days of violence and the community that violence forces people to engage in order to survive. And he really missed that.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're seeing now in the same kind of thing in the first responders. I'm going to kind of come back to this topic more, but you have these paramedics, you have these policemen and women, and then even more so, I think the fire department, because we live, for 24 hours at a time with each other, sometimes even more, and it is a band of brothers. And then when people leave that group, whether it's retirement, whether it's injury, or as I realized even recently, it could even be promotion. We've lost 2 chiefs in this Central Florida area in the last 2 months to PTSD. So being removed from that tribal environment, it appears like their world comes crumbling down then, that support structure was there keeping them up when they were in it, but when they were taken from it, everything changed.
Yeah, I mean, we're clearly wired to survive adversity in groups, and we can obviously do that quite well. And if we couldn't, the human race wouldn't exist. So we can just take that as a sort of base assumption that we are highly adapted to deal with trauma successfully, and that we do that best in groups. Groups of people that we're very close to, not a random group of strangers on a subway car, but people that we're close to, possibly related to, possibly not, but have a really powerful emotional connections to. And that in that kind of circumstance, we can survive almost anything. And again, if that were not so, we wouldn't exist. Or another way to put it is that we're the descendants of individuals in our evolutionary past who were able to survive trauma fairly effectively within their groups. So it stands to reason that if you take a group of people like firemen, first responders, who go through incredibly dangerous, difficult things together and rely on each other psychologically and physically in order to be able to do those things, that you take an individual out of that, the residual trauma that they have, that they experienced as a group with people they care about, people they love, that residual trauma they're now dealing with completely by themselves, or surrounded by people who really didn't have those experiences and don't understand, like their wife, their children, their neighbors, that would be psychologically extremely hard. And that's what veterans face when they come home. But you don't even need to be traumatized. Something like 25% of Peace Corps volunteers, who spend 2 years in a close communal environment in the developing world, which is its own hardship, but it's not necessarily dangerous. Around 25% of Peace Corps volunteers slip into a significant depression when they come back. It's that loss of communality, which is so hard on the human psyche.
Yeah. And now you talk about that in a lot of detail in the book, and I've already read it twice, and I'm going to read it a third time because I absolutely love it. So let's take it right back to the very beginning. You're welcome. And all the other ones as well. I'm halfway through War, and I'm going to be getting Fire next. And then I just recently watched Restrepo and Korengal again, and the look in those young men's eyes, you can see in the policeman, the fireman. Right. It's the same, 1,000-yard stare. But I want to go back to kind of the basis of human culture, so that we can kind of look at our ancestors and learn from them, and then fast forward to where we are now and understand more about, why people are going through this. So your view on humans as a nomadic but tribal society, could you expand on that a little bit more?
I mean, it's not my view. It's the consensus among archaeologists and anthropologists that was our evolutionary past from about 2 million years ago, the advent of tool making, the use of fire, all the way on up through the recent ice age in Europe, and right on up till about 10,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture in the Middle East. that the typical human group was 30, 40, 50 individuals, and that they were highly mobile. They married outside of their groups. They subsisted on obviously on hunting and gathering, and that they were completely dependent on the group for their own survival. Humans, virtually no primates actually survive in nature by themselves. If you find yourself alone in nature, you are dead. You are a dead primate, and so that those human relations are important not just to our emotional welfare, our psychological welfare, but to our physical survival.
Absolutely. And now the example you use, which I found amazing again, was the European settlers in early Western American history being snatched from, where their villages were by Native Americans, and then when they were being quote unquote rescued, them actually resisting and wanting to go back to the Native American tribes that had taken them. Could you tell the people more about that story?
Yeah, it was this strange phenomenon. Strange in the sense that the people at the time were puzzled by it. Here you have a, quote, superior Western Christian civilization bordered by, and this is one of the few times in history this has happened, bordered by basically Stone Age level nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. And what was interesting, and people noticed it at the time, was that as Benjamin Franklin said, we have thousands of examples of young people fleeing the colonies, fleeing the settlements, and absconding to the Indians and taking up with the native tribes. And he said we don't have one example of a native person going the other direction and choosing voluntarily to be part of Western society. And how could that, really confounded people? Like we're a superior Christian society. Like why are the people should be going the other direction? They should be coming towards us, not the other way around. But even, as you say, even people who were captured in Indian raids along the frontier and brought back to these tribal communities, very often, when given the chance to be repatriated during a peace treaty or an incursion by colonial military forces or American military forces, that these people who had been abducted and adopted into these tribes would go into hiding, would avoid being found, would do everything they can to not be repatriated. And again, that really confounded the white Christian sense of superiority that they felt towards what they called the savages.
And what do you think was the driving force behind them returning to the Native American culture?
I think the basic, broad, and fundamental egalitarianism that existed in these societies was very appealing. I think hunting is more fun than plowing fields. I think the sexual liberty enjoyed by these people was much greater and more satisfying than the incredibly burdensome puritanical norms in colonial society. And finally, I think just the experience of a close communal society where people were literally and figuratively sort of gathered around the campfire, that's extremely appealing to our evolutionary wiring. And when given the possibility, many people, quote, go native. Interestingly, we don't have a phrase in English to go civilized, because apparently no one really wants to do it if they have the choice.
I agree with that statement. Like you said in one of your other interviews, you get to walk around almost naked and hunt and have sex a lot versus the alternative. I definitely go there too. So,
yeah, right.
So touching on the Native American concept for the moment, another thing you talk about is the art of the masculine role and also the art of storytelling. Now, I think this is very pertinent right now. We, as a culture in I think any first responders, telling stories of calls that we've been on is a great way of decompressing and again sharing with that quote unquote tribe. PTSD as it stands has almost been shamed in our culture, which I'm hoping we're going to start to try and reverse because it's just ridiculous. The military's already way ahead of us with that. But the storytelling you were talking about in the Native Americans was a kind of a way of boasting, but also a way of showing the physical prowess of what you did and a humanitarian side, what you did for your culture.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine the same thing happens in firehouses and emergency rooms and in police precincts and all kinds of other places, that there is a kind of recounting of one's ordeals and exploits before you're the most important community that you're part of. And so in a lot of Native American societies, after combat, the warriors were given the chance to, through dancing and storytelling and singing, sort of recreate their feats, their exploits on the battlefield. And that presumably provided a kind of cathartic experience for the warrior. It also allowed the community to morally participate in the violent actions that were done for them on their behalf, which of course is very helpful. I think one of the very difficult things for soldiers is, and I guess firemen don't get this, but first responders may not get this, but for soldiers, they're sent thousands of miles away, outside of their communities, outside of their country, to do something that most Americans feel is morally suspect, which is killing other human beings. And then they come back, and it's not really clear like who they did this for and why. And that leaves them in a really profound emotional distress. That's not something, I suppose, that the fire department has to deal with, although occasionally, of course, the police might have to.
Yeah, no, we're definitely fortunate in fire and EMS where we're viewed more as the hero, I guess, of the community. So we're not normally having to make the same kind of decisions that the military and the police do. That leads me to a good question though, and I've heard you answer this before. When people say they're against war, what's your view on that?
Well, I would just ask I would ask about World War II. I would ask if it was okay for them to, in their opinion, would it have been okay for the United States to stand back and watch the German military machine, having killed 6 million Jews, continue its rampage through the world, imposing fascism on virtually all of our allies? Would that be all right?
Yeah.
And if it's not okay, then you're not completely against war. What you're against is human suffering, human misery, and killing. And that's a different matter altogether.
Absolutely. I spoke to Tim Kennedy, the UFC fighter in Green Beret, and he had the same kind of thing as, once you're out there, you've got a job to do. And I know you've said the same thing. The soldiers didn't start the war, the politicians did. But when you see the suffering by these, insane murderers in these different countries, now your goal is to stop them from causing more suffering, and obviously the sad byproduct is civilian loss of life in the process.
Yeah, that's correct. That's right.
Okay, now touching again on the tribal part of the Native American culture, which kind of relates to this, you explained how one of the tribes, I think it was the Navajo, you said, had the two leaders, the peacetime leader and the military leader. I thought that was a fascinating concept.
Iroquois, yeah, it was Iroquois. Yeah, there were war leaders and peace leaders, and the war leaders immediately took over when there was a declared conflict, and as soon as a peace agreement was arranged between the warring parties, the agreement was okayed by the peacetime leaders, and as soon as they gave their approval of the treaty, the war leaders immediately stepped down and were replaced by the peacetime leaders. Peacetime leaders who were occasionally women and often elected by women as well as men.
Okay, that sounds like something we should maybe try in this country once.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, speaking of that, so the other thing is about gender roles. You talked about that in times of crisis too.
Yeah, I mean, the genders are different and they respond to circumstances in very different ways, and obviously are used by society in very different ways because of their different capacities. If you look at statistics, the vast majority, 97, 98%, something like that, it's on that order, of people bystanders who spring into action to save someone from an imminent physical threat, a fire in a building, someone who's fallen onto the subway tracks with a train bearing down, that kind of thing. The vast majority of the people who spontaneously do that are male, young male. And they're superbly adapted for it. Men are, on average, 20% stronger than women in their upper bodies. We know that they have quicker reflexes, all kinds of adaptations that make them skilled at hunting and at war, and at dealing with, in a sort of abrupt, muscular way, with emergencies and crises. What women are really good at is a kind of moral courage. And this was found during World War II, the decision to hide Jewish families in one's basement if you were not Jewish, if you were Gentile. In Northern Europe, during the beginning and during World War II, the decision to hide a Jewish family in your basement, if you were discovered by the Nazis to have done so, meant immediate death. And so the decision to do that doesn't require muscular physical action, but it potentially is just as deadly as running into a burning building to save someone else's children. And women were more likely than men to make that decision, as a kind of moral courage. It's an equal form of bravery, but it requires different actions.
Right. Because I remember you said that the gender roles weren't necessarily filled by those specific genders as well. Because I identify both of those roles within areas of first responders. For example, the fireman that kicks in the door and drags a person out would be probably assigned more to the masculine type of those two gender roles. But then if that same person then has to take off their gear and then take care of them medically, now you're almost slipping into the more compassionate female side of the gender role, but within the same human being.
Yeah, that's right. I looked at a coal mine disaster in Canada in the 1950s. And these people it was all men. They were trapped 2 miles underground by a collapse of the mine shafts because of an explosion. And the first leaders that emerged from this group of, a dozen or so, maybe 18, I can't remember, maybe 18 men, were these sort of proactive, unemotional, unempathic, sort of action-oriented individuals who literally started trying to dig their way past the blockage to freedom. They did that for a few days, and it didn't work. And then the group had to settle into a different kind of survival mode, which was waiting to see if they could be rescued. And when that happened, a different leader emerged. The first kind of leaders, the more typically male in some ways leaders, took a back seat, stepped back, and what emerged were leaders who were very empathic. They were good at keeping the morale of the group up. And, this is in complete darkness while they're starving and dying of thirst, never knowing if they'll be rescued or even if their bodies will be recovered. And in that horrible, horrible circumstance, there were men who emerged they were compassionate and they were caretaking, emotionally caretaking. They wanted people to function collectively in a group. They cared very much what other people thought of their actions. And that was a classically more female role. My point was that there are these two gender roles. They need to be filled, and it doesn't matter if they're filled by males or females. It doesn't matter at all. If a group of women were trapped in a coal mine, some women would step forward in the sort of classically male role, the sort of action-oriented role, and others would fill the other more compassionate role. And likewise, if for a group of men, it really doesn't matter what sex fills those roles as long as those roles get filled.
Yeah, because I think they look at kind of the stereotypical fireman, policeman, paramedic as in a very two-dimensional way, instead of looking at that we need a spectrum of people, because depending on events, you might need a door kicker, like they refer to them in the SEALs, or you might need the person to be the compassionate one in a giant disaster where you've got all kinds of people, extremely upset. So yeah, that could be fit by male or female, but I think emotionally you need that spectrum if you're going to function well as a group.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. So getting back to, you actually in the Korengal Valley, you were assigned to Restrepo, which was named after Juan Restrepo, who was a Navy corpsman. Is that correct?
No, he was in the airborne infantry. He was the platoon medic.
Oh, he was a platoon medic. I'm sorry. I knew he was a medic. Okay, so he was the platoon medic. So when you were there, that group saw more action than anyone else in Afghanistan at the time. Is that right?
Yeah, for a while, most of the majority of the combat in Afghanistan was in that immediate area.
Okay. And what made you decide to go from writing as your main source of media to filmmaking?
Oh, I'd started shooting video a few years earlier. It just seemed like a good way to capture situations that were moving too quickly for me to keep track of in a notebook with a pen. And then I decided if I was going to spend, a year off and on with a platoon, I wanted to write a book about a platoon in combat. And I thought if I was going to spend a year off and on with a platoon, I might as well shoot a lot of video and see if not only would that help in my reporting, but maybe I could make a documentary.
Right. And then the documentary focuses not so much on the actual events. I think the events set the scene, but it's more really the guys once they've come home. So what were your initial observations when you first saw those soldiers back in the civilian lifestyle?
Well, Tim and I spent most of a year out there. We had one chance to interview them after their deployment, but they weren't home. They were in Vicenza, Italy, where the 173rd is based, and we had a couple of days to interview all those guys about their experience of the prior year. They were pretty messed up, actually. They were having a lot of psychological problems.
Right. Yeah. Because you could see that. I mean, being a first responder and seeing my peers. Like I said, we've lost several in the last 12 months. That look in their eyes and that look of being lost once removed from, which most people would look at the most dangerous place you think you'd want to run for the hills from. That yearning to be back there. And I know several of them say that exactly that, almost with tears in their eyes. They wish they were back with their brothers in the Korengal.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a real longing to go back. I think it felt the proximity of the other men made them feel safe, even though that there were bullets flying overhead. And the idea of being without their brothers alone, even in a physically safe environment, like their hometown, was a really dreadful prospect, and very few of them wanted to face it. Yeah.
Now, it's interesting, the observation of how quote-unquote civilization is now, because I know when I've come back from calls before...
Sorry about that.
No problem. Where I've literally had child fatalities and come back to a neighbor bitching at me about allegedly my cat crapping on his yard or something, and it's taken every ounce of strength not to lay him out there in the driveway. So I can't imagine a year's worth of trauma and then coming back to, in my opinion, a very selfish society at the moment. I can imagine that would really enhance the effects of being just dropped back in and removed from your guys.
Yeah, I think it's very hard. I mean, most of them actually didn't come back. They stayed in the military and deployed again. And those were the guys who did the best. The ones who actually got out of the military were the ones who suffered immediate consequences psychologically and really struggled.
Yeah. The observation you've made again, forgive me if this is the Navajo or the Iroquois, you said about the egalitarian system, how the selfish, cancer that we have at the moment, the kind of I want everything mentality, how in a lot of native cultures that just nomadically isn't possible because you can't carry all this wealth with you, and B, any greed is punished because you're taken away from the rest of the tribe.
Yeah, I mean, forget about the Native Americans. If you just think about our evolutionary past, it was nomadic. We came out of Africa. We spread throughout the world as a nomadic species, living in groups of 30, 40, 50 people. And there's no possibility to accumulate wealth because you have to carry everything that you own. So there were no meaningful economic distinctions between people in those small groups. And certainly wealth and power could not be passed on through generations. The people who had authority within the group had that authority, they had earned it, and they were, and their authority came at the permission of the group. And if you didn't like the way someone was running your little band of hunter-gatherers, you were free to get up and go, and maybe join your wife's clan or whatever it might have been. So that all changed with the advent of agriculture. Once you invest years of time and labor in digging irrigation ditches, and you have claim to property, you invest your resources in planting that property. At that point, you can accumulate wealth. There are distinctions of income between people, of wealth between people, and you can be taxed by leaders. You can be oppressed by leaders because there's no way for you to leave. You're too invested in your own property. You can then also have authority structures and armies and police and that kind of thing that impose the will of a leader on the populace. So it all starts to sort of fall apart with agriculture, that broad egalitarianism. So when you have a modern society like the United States in the 1700s, 1800s, butting up right up against a Stone Age culture that was way more egalitarian than we even are today, it's undeniably appealing, and individuals will choose to flee and take up in these quote primitive societies that are actually, in human terms, extremely evolved.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely devolved socially in that respect. There's no question about that. And I think that's, again, the yearning to be back in that group, whether it's military or fire or police or EMS, is when you are, and I'll take my example, if you're a fireman and you're lazy, then you will be ostracized. You'll be known throughout the department as the, excuse my language, but the piece of shit. And, if you don't quit, then you'll end up, bouncing around from crew to crew, never really being happy. And so having that bar set high and expecting other humans to act a certain way, and then you retire, you get hurt, you whatever happens, and you're in a quote unquote regular world, and you see the selfishness and the greed. I think it is amplified, and it makes me extremely angry when I see that kind of behavior. Yeah.
Well, listen, there are very good evolutionary reasons for your anger. Someone who does not carry their weight, who depends on the work of others and doesn't put into the welfare of the group, is not only a drag on the group, they can even be an actual danger to the group, and it's typically dealt with very, very harshly.
Yeah, and they can definitely be a danger in those professions too. I mean, that's the person that's supposed to be dragging you out if you go down, or protecting you with their weapon if you get shot. Well, speaking of that, actually, that transitions well to the other question. You had a great example of an incident, I think it was in Vietnam, where you had you had a special forces group and a lieutenant who was a regular lieutenant, and they measured the stress levels of them when there was an impending attack.
Yeah, that's right. That was in my book, War. And so what happened was, when they heard that there was an attack coming, the stress levels, as measured by levels of cortisol in urine, I believe it was, urine samples, I believe it was, the stress levels in the lieutenant went up. In the special forces soldiers that he was commanding, the stress levels went down, because all of a sudden they had enormous confidence in their skills, and they knew what they had to do. And as soon as they got word that an attack was coming, they started filling sandbags and cleaning their weapons and arranging their ammunition and whatever else they had to do, stringing the claymores and the barbed wire and all that stuff. They got busy, right? And the stress levels went down because they were busy, because they had something to do. And then the window for the attack came, and it went. And it became clear that the attack, there was false information, or that the enemy's plans had changed, and things quieted down. And then the lieutenant's stress levels dropped, and the men he was commanding, their stress levels climbed back up to sort of ordinary high levels where they never knew what was going to happen, and so they were continually on edge. But there was not much they could do about it.
Yeah. No, I find that very interesting, because I think that really leans towards the importance of training in any of the first responder professions. If you have drilled and drilled and drilled and you're prepared, then when the time comes, you get that clarity. And like you said, there's almost an anxiety of wanting a fire, wanting, to get in a gunfight, whatever your thing is. But when the time occurs, then you're ready and you're focused and in that Zen moment, really.
That's right. That's right. No, there's a lot of wiring, a lot of adaptation for us to be highly functional in those moments and very, very anxious when nothing's going on.
Absolutely. So yourself, you obviously saw a huge amount of combat. You were reporting, so you weren't even carrying a weapon. You were there getting shot at and then having to take it. When you came back, did you have any incidents of PTSD yourself?
Yeah, I think probably the first time I had problems was after Sierra Leone in 1999, I think it was. I had some tough experiences there, and I came back pretty rattled. In 2000, I was in northern Afghanistan with Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was killed right before 9/11. I was there a year prior, and back then the Taliban had they had MiGs, they had an Air Force, they had tanks, they had everything, and we got hammered pretty hard a couple of times. And I came back not knowing that I had been affected by it, but I kept having panic attacks. Panic attacks in situations where I felt sort of out of control, like a crowded subway station, that kind of thing. I didn't connect it to combat because there were no subway stations in Afghanistan in the fall of 2000. I didn't think it was combat related because the situation was so different. But I later found out that's pretty typical, that people have panic attacks in unrelated situations where they don't feel like they're in control. In combat, you're not in control. You feel like you could be killed without getting much of a vote in the matter, and that feeling of helplessness is extremely traumatizing. And so anything else that makes you feel helpless, I was in the ski gondola once, and I completely freaked out. I'm not a particularly neurotic person, but, I just completely freaked out in the ski gondola and then on the subway, and it kept happening. And that was, years later, I realized, oh my God, that was PTSD. Wow.
Yeah, it definitely manifests itself in the most crazy ways, from just a mild feeling of sadness all the way through to such darkness that people are taking their lives. So I'm trying to bring that out to the forefront. Now, I want to touch on a couple of things. Firstly, the incident that happened that took you away from journalism within the military itself.
Yeah, my friend and colleague Tim Hetherington that I made Restrepo with, he was killed in combat in Libya. He went over to cover the Libyan civil war. We were supposed to be there together. At the last moment, I couldn't go, and he got killed. And so I got out of war reporting, within about an hour of finding out that he had died over there. It gave me a lot of, I felt very guilty about his death. I felt like I should have been with him, that I could have protected him, that it should have been me. A lot of classic feelings that I remember hearing from soldiers that I knew, that I never quite understood why they felt that way, and then suddenly I kind of got it, because I had those same reactions to Tim's death.
Yeah, and you said you saw the effect of the people that were left behind as well.
Yeah, I got out of war reporting because I saw the effect of Tim's death on everyone that he loved, and I didn't want to risk the people that I loved. I didn't want to risk their emotional welfare on a job that I was totally enamored of, but it wasn't worth other people's sacrifice, and so I stopped.
Yeah, and I think that's another area of PTSD that people don't recognize within the first responder groups is, and I can remember a perfect example. I had a young man literally drop dead in a dog kennel, and a place that you drop off your dogs when you're going away for the day. And he passed away. We did everything we could. And then we were writing the report after the call, and his family were about 8 feet away, just, absolutely in tears and beside themselves. So being left with, the fallout from the family and just being in just pain by their reaction of it, I think that's another area that affects people they don't realize. You couldn't save that person, and that is so frustrating in itself. But then seeing how that does radiate to everyone they love around them, I think is even more heartbreaking. Yeah.
And, I know combat medics have a very, very hard time, because not only are they getting traumatized, not only are they in combat, are they firing their weapons, potentially killing other people, but they're also failing to save their comrades and their brothers, and that's extremely hard on them psychologically.
Yeah, it's it's a very hard thing to come to terms with because in the movies everyone survives, and in the real world not so much. Now, I just want to touch on something, and please tell me if I'm stepping out of line here. My darkest time, I think, during my career so far was when I was also going through a divorce. And I know you were recently divorced. Did the burden of what you'd seen up to that point magnify everything that happened there?
I think my experiences in combat affected my marriage, and I think the divorce affected my attempts to resolve the emotional fallout from combat. For sure, they both affected each other. I'm not sure in negative ways. Both things brought out an extreme emotionality in me, and although it was unpleasant and sometimes awkward, that outpouring of emotions, I think, ultimately was helpful for me. It just didn't feel very good at the time, but I think it was a process that I kind of needed to do, and I think only trauma was going to sort of crack me open enough to have these feelings come out. And the feelings were derived from my relationship with my wife, were derived from my experiences in combat. But of course, for all of us, there are deep wells of sort of sadness and conflicted feelings and residual things from your family. It's a whole messy swamp inside all of us. And, we are, very sensibly and wisely, we wall that stuff off as well as we can so it doesn't affect our daily lives. But at the end of the day, if something breaches those walls and this stuff comes gushing out, in the sort of long term, I think you're well served by that. And both divorce and combat sort of served that purpose in my life. And I really feel like but at the end of the day, I integrated what was deep inside me and what was sort of on my functional exterior. Like those two things got connected and integrated in a way that right now it feels very, very healthy and functional.
Right. And do you find your writing as a form of catharsis? I did my first ever blog a couple of weeks ago. I did about PTSD, and I did another one about sleep deprivation, and both of them were rattling around my brain to the point I couldn't sleep, and I literally, vomited them out onto the keyboard, and it felt pretty amazing after. So do you have that same feedback when you write about the things you've seen?
Sometimes my writing process involves some pretty puzzling and intense emotions, and I guess that's a form of catharsis. I never thought about it like that. I wouldn't say that catharsis to me is an emotional experience that kind of purges you of that emotion and then you're free of it. I wouldn't say it functions that way.
Okay, yeah, that I guess it would be more of a temporary version of. Okay, well, I know that we're getting to the end of the time, so I've got a couple of quick questions for you, and I will let you get on your way. Thank you so much for the time you've already given us.
My pleasure.
Firstly, so what is your next project after Tribe?
I don't know. I'm finishing up a documentary about the Syrian civil war and about ISIS, and I didn't shoot any of it, but I'm acting in the capacity of director, and after that, I'm actually not sure what I'm going to do next. Okay.
Does that project have a title yet?
It's called Hell on Earth, and it comes out with National Geographic this spring. They have not announced their date yet.
Okay, fantastic. And obviously you are a filmmaker and an author. Is there a book and a movie or documentary that you would recommend other than your own work?
Oh my God, I don't know how I could answer that in less than half an hour. There's so many amazing books out there. Peter Matheson was a longtime favorite author of mine. Joan Didion, John McPhee. Any books by any of those people are amazing. Cormac McCarthy as a fiction writer is just phenomenal. Dispatches by Michael Hare is a really fine book about war. And every year there are amazing documentaries come out. I can't even sort of think clearly enough to list the ones that have impressed me. But there's really, really good work being done, and it's worth paying attention to. Documentary film is a sort of very vibrant art form right now, and we communicate a lot of important things that don't quite make it into the front pages of the newspaper through documentary film. Is a really important medium.
Yeah, I agree completely. As a 42-year-old man, it's crazy how you see the same story played out over and over again, sometimes subtly, sometimes blatantly, where they just remake the same damn fictional film. So I think certainly after you've seen that story played out a few times, the documentary side really is a lot more satisfying than the fictional movies. There's only so many, Rambo style movies you can take before it just gets ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, and then what do you do to decompress, or if you need a laugh, what's your outlet these days?
I've been athletic my whole life. I run a lot. I box. I really like playing chess. I play accordion. And I read a lot. I guess those are the main things. Right.
I wanted to touch on that because I knew you boxed and ran, and that's one of the things that well, I guess let me rephrase that. It's one of the only things that they've really shown that is good for that mental trauma is, healthy body, healthy mind. And everyone that kind of really has an aggressive exercise routine or love of sport seems to have a much better coping mechanism usually than the ones that don't. So I think that's an important thing to underline.
I'm not a doctor, but I think, intense exercise probably lowers cortisol levels, and there's a whole hormonal response to exercise that I think is probably really beneficial, all the endorphins and all that stuff. Exercising increases your testosterone, increases your adrenaline. I mean, all that stuff feels really good in your bloodstream. So, I'm not surprised that that's part of a sort of healthy regimen.
Yeah, and I guess also the tribal side. I mean, I think that's why things like CrossFit and mud runs, things like that, have gained in popularity, because you're not putting in a set of headphones and just sitting in a corner on your own. I mean, when you're boxing, you're obviously interacting with all the other guys in the gym too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting, like the boxing gym that I belong to. It's an old gym in New York, and you have everything from like Wall Street guys who come in, take off their suits and work out, to like kids from the ghetto in Brooklyn. But as soon as you walk in that door, everyone's equal, and the way you're seen by others is completely dependent on how you act in there. And that's a very, very healthy environment for everybody. There's no prejudice in either direction, no prejudice against the sort of like elevated Wall Street dudes, and there's no prejudice against the poorer people, the sort of less fortunate who come in from poorer parts of town. Like it's you are completely judged on your actions, and that to me is a sort of deeply tribal arrangement in the healthiest sense, and probably reflects our evolutionary past in a pretty accurate way.
Yeah, no, I'd agree that completely. I mean, you put on a pair of shorts and a pair of gloves, it's pretty uniform from there on. Now it's just about who can hit harder. So
yeah, that's right.
All right, well, I'll let you wrap up, but if you wouldn't mind, just tell people where they can find you and your work.
Well, my website is sebastianjunger.com, and you can find all of my documentaries on my website or on iTunes or on Amazon. Restrepo, Korengal, Which Way is the Front Line from Here, and The Last Patrol. My books are The Perfect Storm and Fire, A Death in Belmont, War, and my most recent book is called Tribe, about community. Amazon or Barnes & Noble, whatever, any bookstore has probably all of my books in them.
Yeah, Amazon definitely does, because I've got them all on my Christmas list. So
great.
The ones I haven't got. So yeah, I highly recommend anyone listening. I think Tribe, I put a post on Facebook today. Tribe basically should be read by every human being on the planet that isn't already functioning as a tribe. So I think everyone, if they took that on board, I think right there we'd start making ourselves a more community-based civilization, which I think we need to. So on that note, thank you so much for taking time. I know you're extremely busy, and you lent your time to this very humble project of mine. And I hope one day we can touch base again in the future. But for now, I will let you go. And thank you again from everyone in the first responder community for, A, your book, and B, taking the time to talk to us.
Hey, well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Good luck to you and to everybody who's listening.